The twins, Westeros. Alayne POV. The grey-haired older man, Brynden, nodded to Alayne before heading back and calling out to the others. Alayne's eyes shifted toward Robb, who was nodding at something the man was telling them before his gaze moved to the girl identified as Arya. The little girl, whose looks combined with her very short hair could easily have passed her off as a boy, was staring at her while her small hands gripped the edge of one of the wooden tables. Alayne then looked away from Arya and turned toward the now dazed bald man, the one she had heard called Lord Bolton. He was being carried over the shoulder of one of the large men wearing a fur cloak. Her eyes drifted back to Arya. Alayne wondered if she could have been her sister had her mother not miscarried. The baby would have been a girl, Alayne thought to herself as one of the men gently pulled Arya back toward the group. Alayne sighed and glanced up at Catelyn, who occasionally looked over at her while nodding at something Robb and the other lords were whispering. Her eyes then settled on a tall woman in a dress holding a sword in her hand. I think she's the one called Daisy, the one whose mother was murdered. The people who had been killed could not be brought with them since they would simply weigh them down right now. Alayne then watched as the armed men began to surround Catelyn, Robb, and Arya. She saw Catelyn turn back to her and cry out, Sansa! Alayne watched Robb and the grey-haired man place their hands on Catelyn's shoulders and whisper into her ears. The older redhead shook her head as they spoke to her. Then Catelyn suddenly turned and looked directly at her. Alayne saw tears welling in her eyes. Alayne felt the same emptiness in her heart that Catelyn must have been feeling. It was the same feeling she experienced on the day the weapons fired by the Brotherhood ships in orbit fell upon London. Tearing her eyes away from Catelyn, Alayne shrugged off her cloak, which had been restricting her movements. She was now dressed only in her flight suit and Kevlar weave vest, with a plasma weapon holstered on her right thigh and her regulation combat knife sheathed along her left. Alayne then noticed Catelyn looking back at Robb, her hand reaching toward the crossbow bolts protruding from his back and chest. The shafts were as long as her forearm. Robb's hand trembled, and his face twisted in pain from the injuries. Alayne rushed forward and grabbed Catelyn's hands before she could touch any of the shafts. Everyone immediately moved to grab Alayne and pull her away. She had to shout for them to listen if they wanted to keep Robb alive. They stopped and exchanged uncertain whispers. Alayne slowly released Catelyn's hands. The look of shock on the older woman's face was heartbreaking. Alayne explained to Catelyn, Robb, and the others that the crossbow bolts were acting as plugs. Without them, Robb would bleed out and die. Alayne forced herself to think back to her training. She instructed Robb to remain steady and told Catelyn and Arya to keep him calm, but not to touch the shafts. Simply trying to leave the great hall with the bolts still protruding from his body would be dangerous, as the sharp heads could shift and cut something vital inside his body. She was especially concerned about the one lodged in his chest. One wrong movement and the bolt head could damage his heart. Alayne looked around. Her eyes found her discarded cloak amid the distant sounds of fighting on the other side of the great hall's closed doors and the pounding of her own racing heart. Taking a deep breath, she drew her combat knife, the blade forged from a new alloy that included Trinium, and explained to Robb and the others what she was about to do. I need to shorten these shafts so they don't catch on anything when we move. She turned to Brynden and the Great John, instructing both men to hold onto Robb. Her voice dropped into a steady, authoritative military cadence. You cannot let him flinch. While they secured him, with Arya and Catelyn already stepping aside, Alayne scooped up her discarded cloak, sliced it into long, thick ribbons with a single effortless flick of her blade, and handed the fabric to Arya. Roll these into tight rings, now. Alayne then stepped directly into Robb's personal space. Hold your breath for a second, Robb, she murmured. With her left hand, she pinched the base of the chest bolt firmly against Robb's blood-stained tunic, anchoring it completely so it would not vibrate. She glanced at each of the men holding him and reminded them not to let him flinch under any circumstances. They nodded. With her right hand, Alayne pressed the edge of the trinium blade against the heavy, seasoned oak shaft about 3 inches from his chest. She applied light pressure and spun the knife in a swift, fluid circle. The trinium alloy cut into the dense medieval wood like a hot wire through butter, scoring a deep, perfectly clean groove around the shaft in a fraction of a second without transferring any kinetic energy into Rob's chest. Alayne instantly withdrew the knife, kept her left hand clamped tightly at the base, and gave the top of the shaft a sharp, precise flick with her fingers. It snapped instantly at the score line with a clean crack, leaving behind a stump with an edge so perfectly smooth it looked polished. One down, Alayne muttered as she moved around to his back and repeated the process on the second bolt, ignoring the wide-eyed, stunned silence of the Northern Lords who had never seen a blade cut through hardwood so effortlessly. Once the second bolt had been shortened, Alayne took the rolled fabric rings from Arya. She placed a cloth donut around the base of each protruding stump, packing them flush against his body to immobilize the fragments. Finally, she had one of the minor lords unbuckle a thick leather sword belt from a fallen Frey soldier nearby. This is going to hurt, but it will keep the bones and the wooden shaft still, she warned Robb. Alayne wrapped the heavy leather belt tightly over the cloth donuts and around Robb's torso, cinching it down hard to act as a rigid splint. Robb let out a ragged gasp, but the trembling in his limbs steadied as the makeshift brace relieved some of the pressure on his chest. Alayne sheathed her knife. A moment later, she became aware that all eyes were on her. Turning toward the group, she found the men staring openly. She simply shrugged. "We've been here for too long," Alayne declared. "We need to leave now." She reached down, picked up her plasma weapon, checked that it was fully charged, and switched it to the stun setting. Holding the weapon firmly by its grip, Alayne moved past the group and took up a position near the front, where the old man stood waiting. "No armor?" he remarked, disapproval plain on his face. "I don't know if you're really a fool or—" The man with the fish emblazoned across his chestplate shrugged. "Or a truly suicidal fool. Uncle Brynden," Robb protested with a frown. "Where are we heading?" Alayne asked Brynden. "The stables," Brynden replied gruffly before adding that he knew the way there. He then glanced over his shoulder and explained that Catelyn's brother and his wife, along with their escorts, would be on the western side of the bridge before making their way to Riverrun. At that, Catelyn spoke up. "The Northerners are heading for Greywater Watch. We are going to take back the North." Alayne caught the conflicted expression on Brynden's face as he stared at the older redhead, who once again reiterated that Winterfell and the North could not be allowed to fall completely. "The North must be secured, Uncle," Catelyn insisted as she approached him. The ring of armored men parted down the middle to let her through. "Robb is the Lord of Winterfell now. He is still the king in the North, and there must always be a Stark in Winterfell. No matter what, I will not fail Ned, and I will not fail Robb." Alayne looked away. She closed her eyes and recalled the route to the exact location where she had landed the jet. When she opened them again, Brynden was placing a hand on Catelyn's cheek. "Are you certain, Cat?" he asked quietly. "I am, Uncle," Catelyn replied with a firm nod. Alayne shifted her attention to Arya. The girl's body language showed no fear, but her eyes told a completely different story. She then glanced at the man standing behind Arya, the one with the burnt face, whose hand rested on the pommel of the sword at his hip. Alayne lifted her gaze to meet his eyes and saw that he was studying her, trying to reconcile her appearance with the girl they called Sansa. The same uncertainty lingered among many of the other men, as well as Arya and even Robb. Alayne looked over all of them before turning back to Catelyn, who met her gaze. "Robb keeps reminding me that you are not Sansa, but—" Catelyn began. "If it makes you feel any better," Alayne replied, "you look just like my mother." She offered her a small smile before looking away and turning back to Brynden. "I'll be heading out with you toward the western side of the castle. There's—" No, Catelyn's interruption was immediate. Fear flashed in her eyes as she hurried forward and placed a hand on Alayne's shoulder. You cannot. You. I have to agree, Robb interjected, shaking his head as he leaned heavily against the larger man. I don't know why you look like my sister, but you must come with us. It's dangerous to be out here in the south, at least while the war is still ongoing. Once we've retaken the north, Uncle, Catelyn continued, turning back to Brynden. We'll send aid back to the Riverlands. I promise. Riverrun can hold out for another 2 years with the stores we have locked away, Brynden replied with a nod. The two of them were speaking while Alayne looked back at Robb, who wore an expression that seemed to plead with her to go with them. She then glanced over at Arya, who appeared to be hesitating over whether to say anything. She must really not like her sister, Alayne thought. But she could not discount the look of fear on Arya's face, mixed with that same hesitation. I'm going with you, Alayne told Robb before glancing over at Arya, who immediately looked relieved before quickly looking away. The Sansa look-alike then turned to Cat and continued, I still have to retrieve something I left in the forest on the western side of the bridge. Your group needs to keep riding to this Greywater Watch place. I'll follow you. But I'm not your Sansa, Alayne interrupted bluntly before her expression softened. But it's my obligation to help, since my people can retrieve me for a few more days at most. Your people? Brynden asked. I have proof that I am different from your Sansa, Alayne answered, looking at Catelyn. All the same, your daughter or not, I'll still help you and your people leave this place. She then glanced at Arya, the sister she could have had. That's a promise. Alayne looked back at Robb and then at Catelyn. But all of you have to ride hard and fast. Get away from here before these guys have a chance to regroup. And they will, Brynden warned, looking at Alayne and then at Cat. We know the back ways to Riverrun. Come with us, Cat. All of you. He looked up at the Northerners behind her. As a larger group, we can fend off. Take Arya with you, Uncle, Robb cut in. Alayne saw Arya look back at Robb with a pained expression. You are not throwing me away, Robb. It is for your safety, Robb insisted, looking at his sister. Riverrun is nearly impenetrable. Go with Uncle Brynden. We will come for you once the north has been retaken, and I am not leaving you or mother, Arya growled. Tears were welling up in her eyes. She then pointed at the burned man and said, The hound will protect me. The hound is the Lannister's dog, one of the men shouted. We're wasting time, Alayne snapped. Everyone fell silent and turned toward her. We're wasting time. We need to get out of here now. Aye, Robb agreed with a nod before turning to Brynden. Uncle, the Northerners will head out to Greywater Watch and he looked toward Arya and the anger etched across her face before sighing. And Arya will come with us. Alayne then turned towards Kat, who was standing in front of her. I need to head west. I really do have to retrieve something, but I will join you. Alayne looked over at Brynden. How long will they take to regroup? Not long, Alayne nodded. Then we need to leave now. She turned to Brynden again. I don't know how to ride a horse, but I need someone to give me a ride to the forest. Alayne noticed the frown on Brynden's face before he nodded. She thanked him before turning toward Catelyn, who nodded back before being pulled into the circle of armed men with Arya by her side. It was then that Alayne turned, prepared to fire her weapon if necessary, before the group moved out into the hallway littered with bodies that were still bleeding. Alayne noticed that the chest plates of the armor bore the image of two bridge towers and what looked like a man hanging from an X-shaped cross. Traitorous filth, a male voice behind Alayne hissed. A moment later, she heard the sound of someone spitting. The boots and shoes they wore squelched as they stepped through the still wet blood while moving toward the end of the hallway. Alayne then lowered her weapon slightly and peeked into the adjoining corridor. It was the same there. More bodies. Alayne looked back at Brynden and nodded before moving into the hallway, her weapon once more trained on any approaching threat. Their feet continued to squelch against the blood-covered floor as they advanced, and with every step, the sounds of fighting and screaming grew closer. Reaching the end of the hallway, Alayne once again lowered the weapon and peeked out into the adjacent hallway, and then almost immediately stepped back and turned toward Brynden. 5 men in the hallway, was all she said before the group drew their swords. The sound of steel leaving scabbards reverberated through the silent corridor and carried to the 5 men who were stabbing the northern Riverlands soldiers still clinging to life. Go see what that's about, one of the men called out. Alayne turned away from the group and looked over at Brynden. She shook her head while Brynden stayed his hand, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his sword. Alayne switched her weapon to the stun setting with a flick of her finger before stepping into the hallway and firing multiple bolts of blue energy down the corridor. It was an energy weapon against 5 armored men with swords charging at her in an enclosed space. The last man fell with blue energy crackling across his body before Alayne turned and smirked at Brynden. The space here is too small. They'll all be coming at me one at a time. So you are a witch then? Brynden asked as he strode past Alayne. She fell into step beside him. As she turned, she caught a glimpse of Arya peering up at her from behind the armored men surrounding her, Robb and Catelyn. I, as long as my family is protected, that's all I care about for now. Brynden told her as the group cautiously made their way toward the stairs at the end of the hallway. As they advanced, Brynden asked whether the men she had shot were dead. Alayne shook her head. Brynden then turned and signaled to some of the people surrounding the 3 Starks to kill the men she had merely rendered unconscious. He faced her again and asked whether she was prepared to kill. She killed those traitors in the gallery, Robb remarked, overhearing the question. At least I think so. They were a bigger threat at the time, Alayne whispered as she crouched at the top of the stairs and looked down the straight path to the lower level, where she could already see bodies scattered across the ground. They were the bigger danger, since they had the high ground. And the ones who attacked later? Catelyn asked. Stunned, Alayne answered, rising to her feet and looking at her. They'll wake up in a few hours. I'll go and finish them off, one of the men growled. Alayne remembered someone calling this man the Great John. He rushed off with 3 others to complete the task. She could have sworn she heard him mutter, "Stupid witches." Alayne sighed before looking over at Arya, who was staring back at her in confusion. Nothing to be nervous about. Arya, is it? I'm not nervous, came the reply. Alayne offered her a small smile while the group waited for the others. After they returned a minute later, everyone cautiously descended the stairs. The sounds of battle were even louder now since the entrance Alayne had used to sneak into the castle was nearby, with several fights still raging. Alayne glanced at the worried Catelyn and then at Robb, who was now leaning against the one called Daisy. Her gaze shifted back to Arya, who was still watching her. Despite what the little girl had said, Alayne could see that Arya was scared. Once the Great John returned, his dagger covered in fresh blood, Brynden ordered the Hound and 6 others to head down the stairs and kill off any Frey or Bolton stragglers who might enter through the nearby passage. Once the immediate area was secure, Brynden and the rest of the group would follow. As the Hound started down the stairs, Brynden glanced at Alayne and told her to watch over his niece and family. Alayne did not think it was the right place to argue, so she nodded and stepped back as Brynden and his men descended. She glanced at Arya again after the Hound passed her. Alayne sensed the giant man watching her, so she turned and met his gaze. Then she arched an eyebrow. "You look so much like the little bird," he growled before continuing down the stairs. Alayne looked toward Robb and then several of the others who were staring at her. Her eyes finally settled on Arya. She holstered her weapon before making her way toward the wall of men standing in front of Arya and the other Starks. Alayne looked at Robb, silently conveying that she meant no harm. He then ordered the men to let her through. The Tauri officer reached into the uppermost pocket on the left side of her vest, opened it, and removed a small, rectangular box connected to a thin wire that led to an earpiece, something the people around her had only just noticed. Alayne was aware the device, a subspace radio, contained a locator beacon embedded within the transceiver. It was something she would need if she was going to protect these people from the air for the next few days before she was rescued. Arya. Alayne crouched in front of her with the wired device in her right hand. She saw Arya staring suspiciously at the object before the girl looked up and met her eyes. when Arya's eyes widened in surprise. Alayne knew the girl had realized she was not Sansa. For now, Alayne pushed that thought aside. Instead, she asked, "Are you nervous?" "No," Arya answered bravely. "And you are not Sansa, are you?" "Arya," Catelyn whispered, shaking her head. "Her eyes are a different color, mother," Arya insisted, shaking her head. And and what she just did, can you see Sansa doing that? Or she is Sansa, Arya. Catelyn faltered before looking toward Robb for support. All Arya and Alayne saw him do was gently squeeze her hand. Alayne then turned to Arya and whispered, "It's okay to be nervous. I was nervous the first day I killed an enemy soldier." She saw that Arya was about to say something, but Alayne cut her off. "I need you to do something for me. Something that will take your mind off being nervous." Alayne slowly reached out and placed the earpiece into Arya's ear, then pressed the transceiver into her hand. Arya looked back at her strangely. So Alayne explained as she helped wrap the girl's fingers around the device. "This is called a transceiver. It's a bit complicated how it works, but all you need to know is that with this, I can know exactly where you are." "See? Witchcraft," a man muttered while the others murmured among themselves. Alayne, however, kept her eyes locked on Arya. "This is highly advanced technology, Arya," Alayne whispered. "It cannot be found anywhere else in this world. So I need you to hold on to it. I can track you and your family with this." She then tapped the girl's ear. "That thing in your ear? I don't want you to be scared, but you'll be able to hear my voice through it later. I mean, I know you can hear me now, but after your uncle takes me where I need to go, you'll still be able to hear my voice." I, Arya slipped a finger into her ear, brushing against the plastic. "There's nothing to be scared of," Alayne whispered before glancing down at the device in Arya's hand. Alayne guided Arya's thumb to a protruding button on its side and gently pressed it down. "When you want to reply or say anything, press this button and speak. When you're done, just let it go, then I'll be able to reply." Alayne studied Arya's expression of surprise and wondered, "She could have been my sister. This girl could have been my sister." The Towery officer reassured Arya once again before rising to her feet and smiling at Robb, who stared back at her in surprise. Then Alayne hurried to the front of the group, drawing her plasma weapon as the sound of metals striking stone echoed up from the lower level. "Cat, we have to move now," Brynden shouted. As the hound approached the lower landing and nodded at Alayne, she signaled for everyone to move down the stairs. Meanwhile, she readied her weapon and descended alongside them. Moments later, she, Brynden, and the other survivors left the relative safety of the castle hallway and stepped out into the hellish nightmare surrounding them. To be continued.